Okay, thank you everybody for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started. So a few housekeeping items really quickly. You may have noticed that all of the attendees are muted on this call, and that's just to make sure that we don't have any distracting background noise during the course of the presentation. However, we do want to hear from y'all. So if you have any questions at any point, there is a Q&A box at the bottom center of your screen. And so if you have a question at any point, feel free to type it in there. We will get back to you. If not during the course of the presentation, we're going to have a Q&A section at the end where we will address those. And so the webinar presentation itself is going to be about 40 minutes long, which is going to leave us about 20 minutes to answer those questions. And after the webinar, we are going to have slides from the presentation as well as the whole recorded webinar available on our website. That's texaslivingwaters.org. I'm also going to send out an email to all of the participants and registrants who are with us today so that y'all can check out that link and you can look at that and then share it around with anybody who you think might find that interesting. So my name is Lizzie Jesperson. I am the Communications and Outreach Manager with the National Wildlife Federation. My co-host today is going to be Jennifer Walker. She is National Wildlife Federation's Senior Program Manager for Water Programs. We both work with the Texas Living Waters Project. So for those of y'all who aren't already familiar with the Texas Living Waters Project, we are a coalition of several different conservation groups that have presences here in Texas. One of those is the Sierra Club, Lone Star Chapter. The other is National Wildlife Federation, where both Jennifer and I work. And then we also have the regional partner, Galveston Bay Foundation. So our team recently released an educational resource that we are calling the Best Bets for Texas Water Guide. Basically, this is an interactive website where we have evaluated the pros and cons of 9 different water supply strategies. And this is something we thought was really important because over the course of our work, we found that there really isn't a shared objective understanding between Texans and decision makers of how the potential impacts of different water supply strategies can be on different groups like humans and the environment. And so we wanted to take a look at those different impacts, both positive and negative, because water supply and making sure we have enough water for every living thing in Texas is incredibly important and is going to become more important going into the future. And so we looked at those 9 different water supply strategies and we evaluated them based on 3 different criteria. We looked at the environmental impact, both positive and negative. We looked at the true costs. So we looked beyond the dollar signs and we looked at how does this impact the greater economy, both state and locally. And we also looked at long-term viability. So in 50 years, will we still think that this water supply strategy was a good investment? So if you haven't already had a chance to take a look at this resource, I definitely recommend you take the time to do so. The link is up here on the slide. I'll also include that in the email that I send out to everybody after this presentation. It just has some information about what these 9 different water supply strategies are. So if you aren't already familiar with them, you can learn a lot more. And then you can also dig into what those different potential impacts are. So again, in that guide, we go really in detail onto what those different strategies are and what the impacts are. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. But we also wanted to use this webinar as an opportunity to step back and look at the bigger picture that really informs where those water supply strategies fit in. So today we're going to cover a few things. We're going to talk about what we know to expect based on projections for Texas's water future. We're going to talk about a few of those different water supply strategies and a few of their different potential impacts on wildlife and Texans. We're going to talk about how Texas water planning works in the first place and how you can get involved in those processes. And then we're going to quickly show you a couple different resources where you can actually find out which water supply strategies have been recommended for your community. So looking into Texas's future, one thing we know for sure, and that is that there is going to be less water available for every person and every business in Texas. We have a lot of great scientific studies and projections that tell us we can expect to see more intense flooding and more intense drought in the future. And we can also expect that between those periods of extremes, it's going to be more difficult for both humans and wildlife to recover. And that's why it's so important for us to do wise water planning. We need to really make sure that we can be resilient and that our water supplies are flexible so we can make it through both of these extremes. One really great resource for looking at Texas's water future, which we're actually going to dive into a little bit deeper and here in the presentation, is the State Water Plan. So they have a website where they show different water supply projects that have been proposed for communities across Texas. They also have some really great projection data for the next decades in Texas. They look at population and what that growth is going to be like. They look at what our water demands are going to be. They also look at what our supplies are going to be. And then when there isn't enough supply to meet those demands, they then calculate what that shortage is going to look like. So the current state water plan projects into 2070. So we've got about 50 years to look at here. And some things we see about 2070 in that decade is that we are going to have 21.5 million more Texas residents. And we're going to be potentially short on water by 8.9 million acre feet each year. So for those who aren't familiar with the acre foot measurement, basically if you take a football field and you go goalpost to goalpost and you fill that with a foot of water, that is an acre foot of water. So we're potentially going to be short on about 8.9 million of those football fields worth of water in 2070. If you look at the demands for 2070, that means we're actually only going to be able to meet about 60% of those demands. This is kind of a look at what we have to expect. It kind of shows us why it's so important that we are thinking really forward thinking and thoroughly and objectively about how we're going to have enough water going into those decades. And Jennifer, I'm going to turn the time over to her. She's going to go into that a little bit more.
Good morning, everyone. This is Jennifer. I see that we have a lot of our water friends on the webinar today, so thanks for joining us, and a lot of new water friends as well, so welcome. So we just heard from Lizzie that our communities are going to need more water in the future. So what do? We plan, and we plan smart, and we hope that this guide helps out with that. So every community in Texas has made choices about their water supply, and they're going to make choices about their future supplies and where they'll come from. There are many factors to take into consideration, such as geography, proximity to a water source, climate, community values, and the ability to invest in different supplies. We hope that communities make these decisions with an eye toward using locally available water supplies and being adaptable and resilient in their approaches. Next slide, Lizzie. So this is all about water supply. So we have been getting water to people for a long time through many different methods, and Texas has implemented all kinds of strategies. Our Best Bets guide covers 9 strategies. We're going to go through some in depth today, but I want to talk about some of the other ones as well. So here's some examples of strategies that we have implemented in Texas and that are, more common. We build dams that impound water and create storage reservoirs on rivers. The Dallas-Fort Worth region and Austin and some of our surrounding communities in Central Texas rely on surface water reservoirs for their water supply. We install wells that pull groundwater up from underground. San Antonio relies primarily on the Edwards Aquifer for water supplies, and many rural areas that do not have easy access to surface water use groundwater as well. Interbasin transfers is another strategy. That's moving water from one region to another, and it's a strategy that some communities use. Another strategy is removing salt or from groundwater is seawater. This is known as desalination. It's a strategy that is gaining popularity as other water supplies become more scarce. El Paso and San Antonio both have groundwater desalination plants that they use to augment their water supply. Wastewater reuse is another strategy that's helping communities meet their water needs. Water providers Water providers create clean water from water from our sewers, and they redistribute it throughout the city, mainly for use for outdoor irrigation and other non-potable uses. Many cities in Texas do this, and it's also known as purple pipe. Aquifer storage and recovery is yet another strategy, and it's being explored as a more efficient way to store water than reservoirs, where evaporation rates can be high. With aquifer storage and recovery, water is treated and then injected underground into an aquifer. The water forms sort of a bubble in that aquifer, and they can be pumped back out when needed. Not all aquifers are suited for this kind of project. San Antonio and Kerrville are a couple examples of cities that have put ASR projects in place. So we cover all of these strategies in our best bet guide, and we go over the pros and cons of each. So I just wanted to kind of briefly go over them and really encourage you all to visit this site and take a closer look. Next slide, Lizzie. So we talk about negative and positive impacts of different water supply strategies. So one thing is that it's important to understand that water supply strategies can have negative impacts on the environment and the plants and animals that live there, and also on humans as well. We're part of the environment. So when planning for water supplies, we need to carefully consider whether or not that supply is really needed, because every water supply project means less fresh water for our springs, rivers, and bays. There is a finite amount of water, and careful consideration of environmental needs should be taken into account. That means just because the water's there, we need to really carefully consider if we actually need it and what the downstream or environmental impacts might be, or impacts to our neighbors even. And the environment is not just all about fish and wildlife. There's a huge industry that relies on our rivers and bays remaining healthy and productive. Nature tourism, birding, commercial and recreational fishing all rely on healthy habitats. Coastal communities and business and industries located adjacent to rivers rely on there being water in those rivers. And another thing to consider is that building water infrastructure is expensive, and it's getting more expensive all the time. So make sure that your community really needs a supply project and is making a smart investment, because everybody ends up paying for it. And big impacts are possible. You know, water supply projects such as reservoirs, flood agricultural lands, and ecologically important bottomland hardwood forests and riparian corridors. Many of these areas are important wildlife habitat and food production zones. So we really need to consider these impacts that can be really large in scale. And on the groundwater side, overpumping groundwater can reduce or stop spring flows. And it could cause land subsidence. We've had a lot of problems with that along the Gulf Coast and the Houston area. So water supply projects have myriad impacts, and you just really need to carefully consider what those may be. So by focusing on supplying more water rather than decreasing the demand for water, Texas is setting itself up for greater water shortages and drought period vulnerability. Our current consumption rates won't cut it in the long term, so the best way to prepare is to invest in strategies that use less water and increase local water availability. So let's talk about some of those strategies. In Best Bets, as I mentioned, we cover 9 water supply strategies. Here are our top 3. So water conservation. On a personal and community level, this simply means that you use less water to do an activity. We have developed technology over the years that allow water users to use less water with every shower, every flush, every load of laundry, every dishwasher load. Really come a long way and really do the activities that we have done with less water. On the outside of your home, you can plant landscapes that are appropriate to the climate that you live in and require little to no supplemental water. If you have an irrigation system, you make sure that it's set up properly and does not waste water. The controllers for those systems have really come along over the last years. So people and businesses need help being efficient. That's why many water utilities have invested in water conservation programs and staffing. The water that is saved more than makes up for the cost of running the programs or providing rebates to customers to get the tools they need to do their day-to-day activities with less water. Water conservation is a hugely important water management strategy. We simply cannot meet all of our water needs in Texas without it. And I would say that water conservation is the most important water strategy for us in Texas. And many cities and communities have really come a far way on it, and some have a long way to go. And we have a lot of experience in Texas that we can share among our communities to really keep that strategy going and to keep achieving more and more savings. The second strategy is One Water. And these three, I want to say these three strategies are all somewhat interrelated, just because water and water supply is related. But One Water is a management strategy that promotes the management of all streams of water within a community. That's drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, and gray water as a single resource. It acknowledges that, that all this water is interconnected and most sustainably and efficiently managed using an integrated approach. And I should say that One Water is also known as integrated water management. You may have heard of it called that. Under the structure, water is a resource that must be managed holistically, viably, and sustainably. Now, as with any water supply strategy, One Water looks different in different communities. Water supply pressures, community investments, and leadership all play a role in how One Water is deployed. There's no one right way to do it, but collaboration is key. So under the traditional approach, different streams of water and responsibility for their management are generally siloed and handled by different departments within a city or water utility, or maybe they're even separate utilities and they don't necessarily collaborate. Under One Water approach, you have all those folks talking to each other and really looking at how they can co-manage and use these different streams of water to really benefit the community. So I'm going to give a few examples of what One Water looks like in practice. One would be increasing urban green space to help reduce stormwater runoff, mitigate flooding, and slow water flow to recharge aquifers. Another would be providing incentives for various forms of green infrastructure, such as permeable pavement, rooftop gardens, and connected wildlife habitats. Communities may choose to collect and use they're known as alternative water sources, such as AC condensate and rainwater, and use it for non-potable uses like landscape irrigation and flushing toilets. Protecting wildlife, rivers, and bays by using water efficiently and then intentionally setting aside water to replenish and take care of watersheds is another tenet of One Water, and one that we are especially excited about. And the third strategy here is nature-based solutions. This management strategy is gaining in popularity and really can kind of be combined with some of the strategies above or separated out. But the idea is to mimic nature's ability to capture more water, whether through rainfall collection systems, land management techniques, replenish groundwater supplies, and slow rainwater runoff. This strategy can also help reduce flooding, which is something that we are becoming more and more concerned about. So the next slide is talking about some of the positive impacts of the strategies that I just went over. So the ideal is to focus on water strategies that benefit both people and the environment. As I mentioned before, people are part of the environment. We have to take care of it all. People will benefit because we have water to meet our day-to-day needs, and wildlife benefit because we're careful about ensuring, updates just popped up right over my notes on my computer. Okay. Wildlife benefits because we're mindful about ensuring that we leave enough water for the environment. We also have climate change and weather variability to deal with. And so many of these strategies that I just talked about increase our resilience and our ability to adapt to changing water supply conditions. These strategies are easily deployed and flexible, and we can save a little water, a lot of water, and we can respond, and we're more agile. Further, studies show that communities that are used to conserving are better able to respond when drought comes. Relying on locally available water supplies such as rainwater, AC condensate, and wastewater reuse reduces demand on the potable water system. This is a real positive thing because moving towards meeting our non-potable demands, things that we don't have to use drinking quality water for, with non-potable water supplies is a step in the right direction and takes pressure off of our potable water system. So many of these strategies have multiple benefits, such as increasing water supply, reduction of flood risk, environmental benefit, and cost savings. So they really need to be evaluated through the lens of looking at multiple benefits and trying to account for them. Next slide. So are the top 3 strategies that I went over enough? Every community is different, so there's no right answer. Most likely, communities will need to look at other water supply strategies as well, and that's okay, as long as they have been asking the right questions, understand the potential impacts, and do everything they can to minimize damage to Texas wildlife and nature. In general, the top 3 strategies are a great place to start. For example, it makes no sense for a community to invest in highly expensive and damaging supplies if they haven't already taken advantage of low-cost, high-return strategies like water conservation. Not only that, but because we only have a finite amount of water, it's irresponsible for a community to pull water away from other Texans and wildlife so that they can continue to feed bad water practices. We will help you determine the strategies that your community is considering later on in the presentation. Next slide. So one of the questions we get a lot is how people can be involved. You can't do that unless you know who the decision makers are, and you need to contact them when you have questions or concerns about how Texas water is being managed. So I want to go over a few different levels of water management and the groups responsible at each level. And then, of course, we're available as a resource too. I mean, that's one of the reasons that we put Best Bets out. And we can, if we don't know the answer, we can definitely connect you to people that do. Next slide, Lizzie. So starting at the top, Texas Water Development Board. They're responsible for several aspects of Texas's water planning. They're a great agency with really helpful people, and they work on innovative water, groundwater science, and bay and estuary science, water conservation planning, but I want to talk about state water planning. They prepare the state water plan every 5 years. The state water plan includes a 50-year outlook on Texas's population, water use, how much water supply we have available, and what the strategies are going to be to meet those needs. This is all put together to determine our water shortages, and much of the the state water plan includes all this information, and then it's all put together to determine where we have water shortages and therefore where we need to develop water supply strategies to meet those needs. And much of that work happens at the regional level, and the Water Development Board provides funding and technical assistance to get that job done. I do want to say one important thing about the state water plan. While this is a really great tool that we have to synthesize all this information at the state level and to get a snapshot of what's happening, we do not include environmental needs in planning at the state in the state water plan. And I feel that the plan is really missing that element. We are doing a great job on doing planning for other aspects of water needs in the state, but the environment is definitely, it doesn't paint a complete picture without environmental water needs. Next slide. So the state water plan that I just talked about is an amalgamation of regional water plans developed by 16 regional water planning groups. So these are closely related, but the state water plan is developed by the Texas Water Development Board. They take the 16 regional water plans that are developed by these local regional groups. So these, the regional water planning groups are comprised of stakeholders and volunteers that represent various interest groups as defined by the legislation that created this process back in 1997. Some of the interest groups that must be represented are municipalities, river authorities, industry, agriculture, water utilities, groundwater management areas, the public, and the environment. And in fact, I serve on one of the regional water planning groups as an environmental representative. The Water Development Board provides funding to the regional water planning groups so that they can hire professional consulting firms to assist in preparing the regional water plans. but much of the work is really directed by the members of the Regional Water Planning Group. Each planning group, in coordination with their consultants, uses the data provided by the Water Development Board on population growth and water use to determine the water demands for the region over the next 50 years. The planning group then determines what the available water supplies are, and if there's not enough water supply to meet the demands, that means there's a shortage, and water supply strategies need to be selected to meet those needs. That's really the nitty-gritty of the work that the regional water planning groups do. It's an iterative process, but I really think the most important part is determining and selecting the water supply strategies. The planners then go through a prescribed process to determine water supply strategies to meet the needs. And you're in luck because this work is actually happening over the next year. So if you want to get engaged with regional water planning and find out what they're considering, now is the time to engage. And participation opportunities can range from just attending some meetings and getting informed and making comments to trying to join your regional water planning group, which is technical and a big time commitment, but there's a lot of people that, you know, get in there and learn how it works and make wonderful contributions to the planning process. So this is regional water plans are developed every 5 years, but right now over the next year, most of the planning groups are actually looking at water supply strategies and making determinations about which ones will be selected. So it's a good time to get involved if you want to. And so now we're going to take it down to the next level, down to the local level. And so this is really where you can have the most direct impact on water supply decisions. You can get involved in many different ways depending on how your community manages things. Many water utilities have public meetings and other processes where they present a slate of ideas or go over water supply considerations. A current example is in Austin. They've just gone through a comprehensive planning process to look at strategies to meet their future needs. They've had several public meetings over the last year and a half and workshops associated with this process. I encourage you all to see if your water utility has an email announcement list, and maybe they send out emails about public meetings and other things so you can keep up to date with what's going on. My water utility still sends out inserts in the bills, and so, you know, reading those is a great way to get information and find out what's going on. But just try to be involved because water supply decisions really get made at the local level by each individual water provider. And I want to talk about one current opportunity right now, and it's the development of 5-year water conservation plans. These plans are due every 5 years to the Water Development Board. This is different than the regional state water plans. These are water conservation plans. The next round of plans is due in May 2019. I encourage you to reach out to your water provider and ask them about their planning efforts and what they're doing on that. Many of the utilities are developing that right now, and these plans include 5 and 10-year goals for water conservation. They list out the strategies that they're going to be implementing. It's a really important plan because water conservation is such an important strategy. And if you have questions about your water utility and their water conservation plan and their programming and how it stacks up, we have actually created a water conservation scorecard where we have looked at different aspects of water conservation programming and have assigned points to them and stuff. And Lizzie can provide a link to that report. But it's a good way to just kind of benchmark your utility and get a little bit of context within it to ask questions about their conservation planning. So I encourage you to reach out to your water providers, ask questions, and get involved. And remember that you are their customer and they work for you. And so you are a stakeholder, even if you've never been involved before with your local water provider. And so I want to turn it back over to Lizzie now, and we're going to go over a few more things, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And there is a Q&A little box down at the bottom of your screen where you all can go ahead and start typing questions if you have any. Lizzie?
Thank you, Jennifer. Okay, so the other question we get a lot is, how do I even know in the first place which water supply strategies are being considered for my community? And there's a few different ways to do that. One is, you know, to really follow your local news. They should really be covering these kinds of things. And the other, which Jennifer really just touched on, is to remember that your water provider is there as a resource and they can answer these kinds of questions for you. So don't be shy about reaching out. It's not weird. You won't be the first person who's done it. And then the thing that I want to go over really quickly, I'm going to do a quick screen share and show you how to use it, is the State Water Plan website. Because again, this is a very large, thorough plan that's been put together by those regional planning groups, and as well as the Texas Water Development Board. And it's a great resource that we should all take advantage of. So if you'll give me just a second here, I am going to share that part of my screen. Okay, so to pull this up, you can just Google Texas State Water Plan. I'll also include this in the email that I send out after the presentation. But you're looking for the Texas State Water Plan by the Texas Water Development Board. This is an awesome resource. And Jennifer, can you confirm really quickly that you can see?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yes.
So this is an awesome resource that has some of the information we already went over at the beginning of this presentation. It has projections for all over the state for what our population is going to look like. You can see here that it also breaks down the 16 different water planning regions on this map. You can click to each of those to dig in deeper. And then we also have graphs that show us the demand projections versus what our shortages are going to be. And we can even go down further and we can look at what the needs are by water user group. So irrigation, manufacturing, livestock. It shows us how much water all of these different groups are going to need over the next upcoming decades. So all of this is awesome, extremely interesting. I encourage you to dig down deeper into it. The thing that I really want to show y'all today is how to look up which water supply strategies have been recommended by the regional water planning groups and the Texas Water Development Board for your community. So the way you can do that is we've got this search bar right here. It says view data for. You're going to click and you're going to go to water user group. Other options are you can look at your planning region and your county, but to get down to the smallest level, you're going to click water user group. So say I am looking for Austin's. I'm going to type that. Click go here. And so right away I have access to several different types of several different types of information. I can see the population growth projections for Austin. I can also see that demand versus supply information that was available. And this is something that's really interesting to look at on a community by community basis. For Austin specifically, we can see that right now we have more than enough supplies to meet our demands, but that ratio really changes over the next upcoming decade. So 2050 is the first decade where we see that our demands are actually bigger than our supply. And then 2060, we have this red bar here is our needs or our shortages starts creeping up. Then you scroll down a little bit further, and then this is really the meat of looking at which water supply strategies and management strategies have been recommended for your community. So some of these may look familiar, some may not. A lot of these things we do cover in more detail in our Best Bets for Texas Water Guide, like aquifer storage and recovery is covered in our Best Bets for Texas Water Guide. It looks like conservation has been recommended for the city of Austin, wastewater reuse, some other interesting things like rainwater harvesting. So this is a really interesting list where you can see what's been recommended. And then if I want to learn more about any of these, I can click on the specific link. And there's not a ton of information available. But what it does show you is that you can look at the total capital cost of the recommended project. And you can also look at the decade that it's supposed to come online. And so this is a really great tool to go look at what's been proposed for your community. And then this is a good starting place for those conversations to have for your water provider. So I can look and I can see that aquifer storage and recovery is recommended for Austin. If I have questions about that, I can reach out to Austin Water and I can talk to them about, you know, is this something that's actually going to be implemented in 2020? You know, that's coming up soon. And I can ask them how they're planning to do that and any other questions I have. So we're going to quickly look at one more place just for an example. So we'll do Waco. Actually, I have a water source here. We want water user group. Okay, so let's look at Waco as one more example. So Waco is interesting, and you'll see this as you kind of click around to different communities. The outlook here is very different. There is a projected water shortage by 2070, but it's not nearly as dramatic as Austin's. And then you scroll down and there's fewer water management strategies that have been recommended for the area. And you can see that there are also some smaller scale things like water conservation is a focus for Waco. So even though they don't have as big of a water shortage projected for Waco, water conservation is still a recommended strategy. And meter enhancement is another form of water conservation as well. And then one last thing, because we had some questions come in before the webinar about things like how much is rainwater harvesting being utilized across the state. So one other cool thing you can do with this database is you can pull up water management strategy is another one of these options to search for. And so I can look for rainwater. I type that in and then the different rainwater strategies that have been proposed come up here. So we can see that it is something that's being utilized across the state, however, not very extensively because it looks like there's 3 different rainwater related strategies across the entire state. So this is a really awesome resource. I recommend y'all dig into it deeper. Really use this as a starting place for getting involved, getting in touch with your water providers, asking questions using the material and the Best Bets for Texas Water Guide. And again, I just want to reiterate something that Jennifer said, which is these state water plans are released every 5 years, and the 2021 water plan, so 2021, is currently being worked on. So this is a great opportunity to pull up the state water plan, to look at which strategies were recommended for your community in the last state water plan, which was 2017. And then to reach out to your water providers and ask, which one of those things are still being considered for the next planning period, what new things are being considered, and if there's any projects that you think should be considered or you have questions about, that's a great time to bring those to that conversation as well. And I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint here, if you'll give me just a moment. Okay, wonderful. So we've got a couple resources here I want to mention really quickly to ask as you're having those conversations, or I guess resources to look at so you know which questions to ask. The first one we've mentioned several times, it's that Best Bets for Texas Water Guide. And then this other one here, I'll include this link in the email that I send out later as well. But it was a resource that the Texas Living Waters Project put together in partnership with a couple other organizations several years ago. And if you are really interested in the financial side of how these water supply projects are potentially going to impact your community, this guide has some really great questions to ask your water provider and other decision makers. Okay, so that is the presentation portion of this. I am going to go ahead and turn our time over to Q&A. I saw a few questions come in as we were presenting. I encourage y'all to take some time to think of questions you have, submit them into the box. And while we wait for y'all to do that, I have a couple questions already that were emailed to us beforehand. So I'm going to ask those, and Jennifer is going to help us out with those questions. Jennifer, one of the questions is, first starts with the statement. So conservation and other strategies like that obviously depend on people doing things differently. So how do we make sure that people actually do it, and isn't that risky?
Yeah, I mean, All water supply strategies have a certain amount of risk associated with them, I would say. I have heard concerns over the years, less and less so now that it's more of a proven strategy, that water conservation carries a certain amount of risk because it's relying on people to do a certain thing. It's relying on human behavior. But I would also say that our kind of, quote, old way of managing water supplies, of building surface water reservoirs and expecting rain to happen and expecting water to be in them at the time that we need it, is also risky. Our climate is changing, rainfall patterns are changing, and there's risk associated with every single water supply strategy. So I think that the key is to diversify, to have lots of different kinds of strategies. And I am comfortable with relying on people using less water, and as long as we can give them the tools as water providers to help them use less water and provide some context on how much water is really reasonable to use in a community, I think that we'll get there.
Thanks, Jennifer. Another question we have is, when we make the case for water conservation to different groups, especially businesses, how do we make a financial case for it?
I think that I mentioned earlier about taking a complete look at different water supply strategies and looking at co-benefits. I think kind of the same strategy applies here. So in looking at a cost for water supply strategies, we really do need to be able to not just look at the straight cost looking forward, but look at how much would we pay if we do conservation, how much would we pay if we didn't do conservation, or whatever strategy we're looking at. I'm using conservation because it's my favorite. Water conservation involves, it's kind of a head scratcher for people because you're asking them to use less water, but you're also telling them, we're going to be paying more for water in the future. And folks are like, but I'm using less. I don't understand why. The thing is we're all going to pay more in the future for water. It's very, very likely that that's going to happen. We have employees to pay. We have chemicals to buy to treat the water. We need energy to move the water around our communities. We have infrastructure that either hasn't been paid attention to for a while or taken care of, or infrastructure that needs to be installed or repaired. All these things are cost drivers, and they're still there whether you're using less water or not. So we're going to have to pay more in the future, but if we're having to bring in additional water supplies or build big infrastructure projects, we're going to pay more than we are without water conservation. So I think that folks have to take kind of a more expansive look at the costs that we're paying for water and really look at all the costs and look at the alternatives. I'm paying more for this alternative, but if we did this, it would cost me even more. So I'm making a lot of hand signs, so it's kind of hard to see. I hope folks are understanding that, but I do think that it's really important to kind of take a complete look at the cost scenario. And there's a lot of good work out there about that. I would really point people towards the second guidebook that Lizzie mentioned at the end to really kind of think about costs, but also the Alliance for Water Efficiency, which is a national organization, has a lot of really good materials on that and has some information for different cities that have done studies looking at the cost of providing water with one set of strategies versus another to really illustrate that concept that I just tried to describe.
Awesome. Jennifer, last night we had a couple different questions come in over email about groundwater and how we can potentially get over some of the legal regulatory problems that are related to that. So can you first give us a really quick overview on how Texas groundwater is regulated in the first place, and then talk a little bit about whether there's any good solutions to the impact of how groundwater is being tapped and what that has on rural communities?
Well, that is a really good question. And there's probably a lot of people on this call that could do a better job answering it than I can, but I will try. Groundwater, it's a little bit fuzzy on how it's managed on some respects. In areas that have groundwater conservation districts, they can regulate the withdrawal of groundwater and issue permits for groundwater withdrawal. But there is definitely some uncertainty depending on where you're looking about ownership of groundwater and whether you have to produce it or whether you can conserve it in place. So it is definitely one of those issues that is a lot more complicated. The interesting thing is that in Texas, we manage our surface water supplies and our groundwater supplies completely differently and consider them to be separate sources of water when we know that they're actually commingle quite a bit. I mean, groundwater, springs that emanate from groundwaters and seeps provide base flows for many of our rivers, especially in the hill country. Rivers lose water or recharge aquifers as water moves through rivers. So they really are symbiotic in many areas of the state, but we don't manage them as if it's that way. Now, specifically, I think you asked about rural areas. It's a little harder sometimes in rural areas just because some of this big planning takes resources. I do think that groundwater conservation districts and the regional water planning process are really good areas for regional and rural water providers to kind of engage, because there's a lot of folks from rural areas on the regional water planning groups, and we really do discuss, like I mentioned, I'm on the Region K water planning group, really do discuss the issues in those areas and reach out to folks in rural areas, to county leadership and groundwater district managers and other folks to try to get their input on the plans. So, groundwater management, whether it's groundwater or surface water, is complicated. So there's not really an easy answer to that. And it's very local depending on your local set of circumstances.
So we had through the Q&A a similar question come in to what you were just discussing, Jennifer, but I wonder if you can address this directly. This question says, who's looking after the rural areas where population pressure and influence is not as high to draw attention to the less populated areas?
So I think the answer is it depends. I mean, regional water planning groups, groundwater conservation districts, in my experience, a lot of the rural areas, the county judges, the county commissioners are strong advocates. I talk to your local representative. You may not, you may have like a private water supplier, or you may have a private well. So you need to, it's not as easy as going to talk to your water utility or whatever. So there's these different layers of management and oversight that are out there. So I say talk to your local state representative, talk to your county leadership, your groundwater conservation district. Folks at the Water Development Board can let you know if you're in a groundwater conservation district and who the contact people are for that. Your regional water planning group. So all of those folks are definitely great resources to kind of try to drill down into who's making decisions about your water supply. And if you're like on a personal well out in a rural area, then you really should be engaged in these processes to know if there's things around you that may impact your water supply, either from water quality or availability standpoint.
Okay, another question. Somebody's wondering if they noticed a lack of information on agricultural production and whether that's something that is regulated by the state.
Great question. Yeah, we didn't really talk about ag production in this too much. One of the reasons is there's really kind of where we are really kind of focusing on municipal water use. If you go and look at the interactive state water plan that Lizzie had up towards the end of the presentation, you just look at the state one, you'll see the trend line is that ag water use or agricultural water use is still the highest in absolute water use in Texas, but it's trending down. And municipal water use is trending up, and they actually cross in the future, and municipal water use outstrips ag water use. Now, there's a lot with that and a lot of reasons why that's happening. One is that agriculture is becoming more efficient. It can certainly become even more efficient, just like cities can. But we really are focusing on municipal water use, because that's really what is driving a lot of the change. And there are folks that really focus on ag production. And I'll say that in my experience on the regional water planning groups, agricultural water use is absolutely an area that we do planning for, and we really dig in deep. There's a lot of agricultural water use and in the region that I help do planning in, and I'm sure there is in many other regions in the state. In fact, I probably can't really think of one that doesn't have it. So I think that's a really good area to engage, but absolutely agricultural water use is hugely important.
Okay, another question we have here is wondering how cost effective it is to set up for reusing water for non-potable purposes. And they're wondering both individually and on a city level.
Can you repeat? Oh, maybe it's on here. Okay, I'll just read it. How effective is it to set up reusing water for non-potable purpose? So this is a really new thing, and thanks for the question, Misty. So are a couple different levels of this. So non-potable water that's distributed throughout a city on a centralized purple pipe system. This is wastewater that goes through our wastewater lines to the treatment plant, and then the wastewater treatment plant then cleaned up and then redistributed through our cities to use mainly for lawn irrigation, sometimes for cooling purposes. That's been around for a little while, and it is generally pretty expensive endeavor. And the people that are using that water are not paying the full cost of providing that water. But the value is seen as being there by reducing pressure on the potable water system. Now, the other thing that we're seeing is that individual buildings or district scale developments are incorporating this on an individual level. For example, the new library in Austin is a great example of that. They're capturing AC condensate and rainwater, and they're using that water to flush toilets in the library and to do landscape irrigation. So 95% of the total water use of that building is being met by non-potable water that's generated on site or captured through rainwater. That's huge. That means only 5% of the water for the 6-story big building downtown in Austin, our new central library, is coming off the potable water system. So that means that water, not having to pull that other 95% of water off the potable water system makes it available for other uses. Now, it's really only effective to do this kind of thing on new construction. But there's plenty of that going on in almost all of our cities in Texas.
Okay, another question we have here references the Bamberger Ranch and that whole process where they really transformed the landscape and the productivity of the ranch by primarily planting native grasses, because they have really deep roots and they can get water absorbed back into the ground and back into the aquifers. So with that in mind, their question is, do any water conservation plans include the use of native plants or other phytomediation?
Yeah, so that really goes back to those nature-based solutions that we talked about, or green infrastructure is another term that is known by. I've been out to the Bamberger Ranch, and it's incredible what they've done out there. It's really inspiring. And that absolutely is happening on different scales in cities around Texas. And I think that we really can and should do as much of it as we can. That's really something that they're looking at in the Houston area to help with reducing the impacts of floods, because I know they're going to get more rain events in the future, and can use that to slow down water and to help it absorb into the ground. So it's definitely an important part of the water supply mix. It's something that's a little hard to quantify, but I think the benefit is definitely there.
Okay, we had a question come in, Jennifer, that you might want to kind of look at along with me because it's a long one. But it looks like there's several different questions embedded in here. So one is, we just looked at the state water plan and we looked at Austin first, and then we looked at Waco. And Waco wasn't forecasted to experience as significant of a water shortage in 2070, but Austin is. So what is Waco's obligation, if any, to ensure its water demands do not adversely impact downstream users and natural resource demands?
So the answer is it depends, as it is with so many of these. Two of the most common answers I give for things are it depends and it's complicated. But it depends on the water rights that Waco has, if there's any conditions put on them, if they're buying water from somebody. Some water rights have conditions on them saying that you have to return water, have return flows or water from your wastewater treatment system, return downstream for downstream water users. So it really depends. I don't know that Waco has any obligation to ensure that its water demands do not adversely impact downstream users or the environment. And I think that that's something that we really are going to have to come to terms with as our population grows and our water demands increase, because that's not typically something. Most cities have water in their community, they treat it. The kind of general rule of thumb is about 60% of it gets returned downstream below the city, like back into the river that it came out of or some other body of water. And as cities start to use more and more of that water locally and use it more effectively, then we could see less water downstream. And that's a big problem, not only for other cities downstream that are relying on that water coming down, but for fish and wildlife habitat and for our basin estuaries that are at the end of our rivers. So we actually really need to have some real conversations with each other about how we're using water, and if we're making sure that there's enough left for everybody and every living thing, not just people, but the environment as well. So it's a great question and it's really complicated. And I will say that this is something that we're going to be trying to, a question that we're going to try to wrestle with a little bit on the Living Waters Project. We're putting together some white papers on this and trying to, this is work that's just starting, trying to wrap our heads around how a city that's deploying One Water strategy would also make affirmative commitments to the environment and what that means. So stay tuned, and I really appreciate that you are thinking about it like in that way and thinking about the question like that, because it's important.
Mm-hmm. And related to that, the second part of that question is, what can Austin's upstream and upgradient neighbors or neighboring counties do to help Austin meet future water needs?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that we can do as a region is actually all work together. For Austin, you use as an example, we share the water resource, our main water resource, which is Lake Travis, Buchanan, the Highland Lakes on the Colorado River. We share that resource. I mean, and I'm in Austin, so I'm saying we, but we share that resource with many other communities that are around the Highland Lakes. I mean, we're the biggest one by far, but we're not the only user. And so I think that we actually really need to work collaboratively with all the other water suppliers around the Highland Lakes to make sure that we're using water supplies as efficiently as possible. So we have a shared responsibility in preserving our water supplies for the future. And, in this watershed in particular, our water supply from water quality perspective, it's in really great shape because we don't really have discharge, we don't have upstream users really. The Colorado River, while it's long and goes all the way up to the border with New Mexico practically, is effectively kind of cut off. So the Highland Lakes really are a pretty good source of water. And you have different situations like where you have Dallas is sending water down the Trinity River to Houston, and that's a much more connected and tangible way. So, if I was Houston, I would be concerned about Dallas communities upstream and how much water they're returning and what the quality is and all the different users. So, you know, folks that are at the end of the line on rivers definitely are concerned about what happens upriver, and it's in their interest to talk to surrounding folks about it. I hope that answered your question.
So we are coming up on time here. I have 2 more questions I want to ask you, Jennifer. And then if anybody has any other questions, you can always be sure to reach out to us after this presentation. So one question relates to what you were just talking about when it comes to, you know, having upstream and downstream water users and balancing those needs. The question is, in regard to the current question, how do the river authorities fit in, like LCRA and Brazos River Authority?
Absolutely. The river authorities are super important. And I think that the river authorities can be a huge part of the solution and a huge driving force. I mean, really, the river authorities control a lot of the water in the state and can really drive a lot of the water management practices. So I do think that river authorities should try to be really proactive in encouraging and supporting water customers, people that buy water from them, like Austin and other communities, to really, you know, double down on efficiency, make sure that that the water supplies go further. River authorities can also make affirmative commitments to meeting environmental needs as well as human needs. That's really important and something that we've been talking about a lot. And the river authorities are really involved in the regional water planning process, the ones that I am intimately aware of. This is a venue that they really engage in at that level. So if you're interested in river authorities and kind of how they're engaging, then definitely at the regional water planning group level is a good place to look.
Awesome. Last question here is an interesting one. Carl's wondering whether any market-based approaches have been proposed in terms of purchasing or selling water allocations. And the example they're referring to is, again, that Austin and Waco example. So where Austin would be purchasing and Waco would be selling.
Yeah, that happens around the state. Houston is a huge water provider. They are a wholesale water provider to many of the communities that surround them. Austin actually is a wholesale water provider to a couple communities around us. So that kind of stuff definitely happens. The way that you describe Waco selling to Austin is less likely because we're pretty far apart. You have to build infrastructure. It's expensive. I mean, it's at least downhill, but yeah. So that's probably, it's not as probable in that actual scenario, but it is definitely something that happens.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer, for fielding these questions. Thank you so much to everybody who joined us today. Again, if you have any questions, we are here as a resource for you. I will send out the contact information for both Jennifer and myself in that email that I've referenced several times. And if you have any questions at any point, please reach out to us or other members of our Texas Living Waters team. Jennifer, is there anything you want to add?
No, I really I'm really happy about all the people, and I scrolled through the list. There's a lot of folks I know, a lot of folks, most of y'all stuck with us to the end. So thank you so much. I hope this was useful, and I absolutely am willing to answer questions afterwards and help you learn more or to learn from you. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.